Another response video to an Anekantavad video, Depressive Realism. So we'll play it and talk, but yeah, it's a short video, so we should be able to do this without going over 2 hours.
Moss asked me to respond to an essay that he sent me concerning a phenomenon known as Depressive Realism.
Okay, so that's all you need to know for the beginning, and then we'll just jump to the end. So right there, we know what the subject's about. Is like, how do you know what reality is? And it depends on what kind of depth of the question you're asking is, right? I mean, we can answer, I think, some of the questions. We can say that evidence indicates things. Possibility and probability are part of that equation. So we can talk about, what's the reality of our origin, our biology, the mechanisms of the function. Now you want to get into a conversation about the reality of value perceptions. Yeah, then you're going to have to talk it strictly and kind of in more confined to some sort of logical argument. You're not going to have biological evidence per se. You're going to have some sort of you're going to have to work up to it based on premises of understanding. So let's start with a premise of understanding that individuals are playing a game. They're goal-oriented, let's say. And they all run a narrative, a story, that is the kind of game they're playing, whether it's baseball, football, soccer, or hockey, let's say, basketball. And we all have our story, and each one of those games, different things define what a goal is, what scoring is, what putting the slam dunk, the whole thing. All of that is equated into their value narrative, their story that they're telling. And so that's sort of the problem is that, yes, people are entitled to make up stories about what game the game of life is. Because it's not going to be written on some book, and it's not going to be written on a rock somewhere that's going to be so easily described as what's a good game and what's a bad game and all that kind of stuff. What's the better game to be playing, the more realistic game in terms of what we're acquiring. I would argue that we can know some games are out of bounds. Drunk driver game, rape game, murder game, games that involve slavery game, exploitation game, liar game, games where you're basically there's no good fairness rules, where the two competitors don't come into the ring equally matched and have a fight. Now one uses like a midget to beat the other one to death or something. There's some sort of maybe even double or triple or quadruple foul where they are fouling not only the people they're using, but the people they're using to abuse somebody else. That kind of crap. So we can qualify those games as outside the realm of potentially efficient, because we can know certain concepts about certain. We'd have to agree on a premise of value, and the premise of value would have to have something to do with some notion, some consistent definition of harm. Some rational one, right? We can say, can't we say there's a rational definition of harm? It crosses all biology in terms of all mammalian species, all sentient species. We could almost argue do have two qualitative states, desirable and undesirable, and we can argue that part of this whole narrative thing and part of goal scoring for individuals is attaining the desirable states and avoiding the undesirable state, and then that's the game. That's a common theme in all games being played from the individual point of view, and that all we're really saying is if that individual game is crossing over into somebody else's game, that's a foul against fairness, we could say. That's not allowed. You're not allowed, if your game is going to harm somebody else's game, change the capacity of them to play their game in some way that you're not, by some reason, entitled to compromise their game. Like a rape victim is entitled to say, no, you may not please yourself at my expense. These are trespass lines that we can sort of understand, that there's a territory that belongs to a person, and then there's a responsibility that belongs to a person. So they have rights as long as they don't cross a responsibility to somebody else's rights. Those are themes that can be understood. I think reasonable people, logical people, could agree that those are kind of absolutes. We could sort of write them in ink. They're not too hard to say that's probably fairly reliable as a realistic approach to coming up with the right definition of appropriate gameplay. So I mean, I don't think it's out of our hands. If I think it's a worthy conversation, but it's going to have to be a little bit meticulous, I guess, a little bit careful in how you word everything. But it has like those elements of the Jeffersonian principles, the fact that we don't have an ideal way to arbitrate these disputes over territory. Because some people's narratives are plainly silly. Somebody is not entitled to think black people are inferior and they may use them as tools to plant a more fertile garden. That's not legitimate because it's not reason-based. It can't be defended rationally or logically. And so those kind of standards I think we can agree on. And what extent of it? Like I said, do we have to have the agreement of the rapist when we're going to go pass a law against rape? I don't think so. I think there is a point where you can say those people have no concept of borders, no concept of keeping their game within these boundaries. So I've argued that the fundamental word that we're after in the game, as we're playing it, is this idea of fairness. And that theoretically, you can't really have fairness without something called consent. You can't be playing against people who don't want to be there playing. You can't play people who don't want to be played. You can't claim a victory over somebody who didn't sign up to compete. So, there are all kinds of fundamental problems in the fact that how we're put here into this predicament. And now the evaluation of something in terms of what reality is, in terms of obligations and value equations, gets a little more complicated because of this idea that we are aware of the game. It's not just some sort of biological game anymore. It's not just competing. We're not great white sharks. We're not ignorant animals. We are intelligent. We are capable of understanding those trespasses and those cheats of, might makes right. No, it doesn't. Right requires something more than merely the ability to take. You have to have more than that. You have to have a reason that's better than the reason for the other person to be entitled to keep what they have. They've earned it. You do have a right to take it if they didn't earn it. Yeah, but that's not the premise that we'd be arguing from. All right, so how to deal with this in terms of simple concepts. Well, I guess the narrative idea is the good one. That we're all telling stories, and there's some liberality we have in what kind of story we're allowed to live by. But there is a limit to that liberalness. The limit is you don't have a right to make victims. You don't have a right to impose. You don't have a right to trespass. You don't have a right to, let's say, exploit is a good word, abuse. You have a right to maybe use, but you don't have a right to abuse. These kind of, they're subtle lines, but they're important lines. I mean, it's a legal definition in the end. Kind of like the idea of fair use. I mean, you know it when you see something that violates it. And you can certainly put some things in the category of intrinsically unfair, would be malicious, because that intends to be negative. And that sort of gets back to the original point, which is depressive realism, in the sense that what's argued is that we have innate bias in our hunger. So if we are hungry for something, then we will contrive a narrative to give us cause to have what we're hungry for. And it's that aggressiveness that of that desire that accounts for a lot of biases that corrupt people's judgment and inability to make rational risk assessment, to say, okay, you can't, it's like driving, right? I mean, the rational person understands you don't drive when you're compromised in some way. You just drank a bottle of cough medicine, whatever it is. You know you're compromised. You don't drive because you know it's not your risk, it's the risk of the other people on the road. And likewise, if you know your car's broken or damaged, you know it's not you're not assigning the risk to yourself, you're assigning the risk to the other people who are now going to be subjected to potentially being catastrophically ruined because your desire allowed you to not rationally recognize that your convenience is not worth this jeopardy you put them at. Again, the trespass. You're not likely to see the trespasses if you're driven by a passion. So it's much like the heroin addict, and we can see the corruption of their judgment by the addiction. The addiction can get them all the way to a point where a good person turns into a very bad person. And they start rationalizing all kinds of very negative, very destructive, very hurtful behavior because their desire is so strong. Their need and dependency is so strong that they find excuses to do things they would not excuse if it was not for that desire, that necessity, that passion. So yeah, let's not drag it out too far, because I don't think you're terribly interested in having the detailed conversation about the nature of desire and the main things that are revealed in terms of our optimism bias and our speciesism. You know, my use of the Martian example, for example, the fact that we can be seen for what we are by just recognizing how we don't apply our values consistently. So that would be, for you, evidence of how you define a realistic narrative is a narrative that is consistent. If it contains inconsistencies that have no logical justification, where there's a logical imperative that the two things be treated equally, and our narrative doesn't treat them equally, that's cause to say that narrative's probably not realistic. It's not. It can't likely be accurate if it contains gross contradiction. And other flaws, again, would be structural in the terms of defining reality itself. The God delusion, for example, would be a pretty obvious a narrative that contains my reward in heaven is likely to have nothing to do with reality.
That of others. I want someone to tell me.
So he calls it tyranny, which is fine, but you know, this idea of trumping, you know, one narrative trumping another narrative, and I think in the case of democracy and even the evolution of civilization, that most of the trespasses that have been perpetrated are reasonable, realistically leading to a more efficient outcome, a better outcome, by any rational definition of a better world, by a rational definition of value, in the sense that the humans have benefited from these elements of civil progress in terms of recognizing rights and attempting to be as unrestrictive on freedom as possible.
How we can arrive at that. How can I arrive at an assessment of reality that is more accurate and that is sufficiently accurate to say it is right and another assessment of reality is wrong?
Right. So he's using incredibly vague language here, right? Because assessment of reality is just a word. It's a sentence, but there's no such thing. We don't assess reality. We describe reality, and you either accurately describe it or inaccurately describe it, and you're describing two elements. The first element of reality is physical. What's the physical reality? And then the moral landscape or ethical landscape exists on a different plane. It can be only seen through logic and understanding and intelligence. It doesn't have any material form beyond the material that creates the sentient organisms that have a welfare state that has value. Again, that's a premise that has to be accepted. If the person isn't willing to accept that the capacity of sentient beings to experience very unpleasant sensations is not an important feature of the material universe, then you really can't have a conversation about any kind of landscape where that is obvious to someone else. Like I said, it's obvious to me because I'm a sentient being. I know the difference between the two feelings. I know one is decidedly good and one is decidedly bad. And it seems ludicrous that I'd have to have a conversation with other sentient beings and make that declaration. I mean, I really shouldn't have to explain that. We should be able to agree that that is a component, at least. I would say it's the entire substance of value, but it's at least a component of value. And anyone who disagrees, I would say, yes, that's a person I don't want to have supper with. I don't want to do anything with, because they obviously have no respect for my fundamental welfare, as they can't even recognize how I fundamentally function, which is I feel good and I feel bad, and I don't want to feel bad. And if that person doesn't understand that that's my primary focus of my narrative, my game, then they're probably going to be very dangerous to my welfare. So that would be an element where you can say agree to disagree, but what you have to do is agree to not interfere with each other. And again, I would argue that gets very difficult if you're going to be in the creation business, because that's about as much of an interference as you can possibly commit. In animating Frankenstein, that's pretty much getting up Frankenstein's ass. The monster, anyway. So, let's just play the ending.
Because that's essentially what realism is saying. I'm showing things for what they really are. Okay, prove it.
Well, again, I think the logical proofs are there. I think for the material universe, there's absolute material evidence of high reliability and integrity. So I think that's one argument. Let's argue about the material fact of our existence and the material fact that there is not a God. And then you move on from that to what is the consequence of that in terms of the development of our psychology and the values it places on things, and whether the values it places on things are consistent with what would be a logically constructed understanding of what's being traded here. And I would argue that we can understand that what's really of value, what makes everything that we say has value to something has value, is the fact that you trace it to the welfare of a sentient somewhere. That all value is derived by its impact on a sentient. That you can describe no event in the universe that does not affect a sentient organism and say that event has meaning. Because I don't think it does. The only events that have value weight, value gravity, value meaning are events that happen to feeling organisms. And like I said, if that can't be a premise, I would argue that one is right and one is wrong, I guess you could say. Or you're both wrong. I don't know how they could both be wrong because it's such an absolute statement. But yes, I would argue that this value is real. It is enduring. It is the substance. It is the meaning. It is everything that matters in the universe. Its waste is perfectly satisfies the definition of tragedy. Yeah, alright. Enough first installment. Maybe we'll see if it goes any further. See if it goes any deeper. So anyway, till next time. Such.